The United States, emerging from World War II with the most powerful military in human history, with an economy that had grown enormously during wartime production, with technological superiority in everything from aircraft to atomic weapons, faced a choice that seemed straightforward to most observers in 1945. Demobilize the massive military as had happened after every previous American war. Return to the traditional peacetime force of a few 100,000 troops. Shut down the weapons, factories and aircraft plants and shipyards that had employed millions, and return to civilian economy, allowing the free market to determine what got produced and how resources got allocated. And this was what Americans expected. Polls showed overwhelming support for bringing the boys home, for ending rationing and war production, for returning to normalcy. And initially, this demobilization happened. 12 million people left military service within 2 years. Defense spending dropped from 38% of GDP in 1945 to 4% in 1948. Weapons production largely ceased, and it seemed America would return to its traditional pattern of small peacetime military and minimal permanent arms industry. But this demobilization reversed within a few years. The Cold War created perceived need for permanent military readiness. The Korean War remobilized defense production. And by the mid-1950s, America had created something unprecedented in its history, and perhaps unprecedented in human history, a permanent, massive military establishment, hundreds of thousands of troops stationed globally in peacetime, nuclear weapons and delivery systems requiring constant production and modernization, a network of defense contractors and subcontractors employing millions and operating in every congressional district, research institutions and universities dependent on defense funding, and a revolving door between military leadership and defense industry that created aligned interests and coordinated lobbying. And this system, which President Eisenhower in his 1961 farewell address famously called the military-industrial complex and warned against, became the dominant force in American political economy, shaping foreign policy and domestic spending and technological development and regional economies. And understanding how this system works, how it perpetuates itself regardless of external threats, how it drives spending and intervention that serve its interests rather than national security, how it corrupts democratic processes and distorts economic priorities, and why it proves almost impossible to constrain despite periodic reform efforts and despite the obvious waste and the catastrophic interventions it produces. This reveals fundamental truths about how concentrated interests override diffuse public interest, how institutions designed for one purpose evolve to serve themselves, and how the intersection of profit motive and government power creates pathologies that undermine both capitalism and democracy. The origins were genuinely about security, because World War II had demonstrated that modern industrial war required massive productive capacity, required ability to build thousands of aircraft and tanks and ships, required technological innovation in radar and cryptography, and eventually nuclear weapons. And the lesson American leaders drew was that maintaining this capacity in peacetime was essential. You couldn't wait for war to start and then build up industry. Modern war happened too fast. Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima was less than 4 years, and future wars might be decided in months or even days, especially with nuclear weapons. So there needed to be permanent readiness, permanent research and development, permanent production capacity that could be ramped up quickly if needed. And this seemed reasonable given the Soviet threat. The USSR had massive conventional forces, had proven willing to use military force, was ideologically committed to overthrowing capitalism, and was developing its own nuclear weapons. So maintaining strong defense seemed prudent, and defense spending stabilized at around 10% of GDP during the 1950s, much higher than historical peacetime levels, but justified by the unprecedented threat. And this created the initial infrastructure, major defense contractors like Lockheed and Boeing and General Dynamics, military bases across the country and around the world, research programs at universities and national laboratories, and government arsenals, and shipyards. And all of this was defended as necessary for security, as the price of preserving freedom against totalitarian threat. But even in these early years, the pathologies were emerging. Defense contracts were cost-plus, meaning contractors got paid for all costs plus guaranteed profit, removing any incentive for efficiency. And military bases were distributed based on congressional politics as much as strategic need. with powerful congressmen ensuring their districts got facilities. And spending and weapons programs were justified by worst-case assumptions about Soviet capabilities, creating arms races where each side's buildup justified the others, and defense contractors began hiring retired generals and admirals, gaining inside knowledge and influence, and the system began developing its own momentum, began perpetuating itself through mechanisms that had little to do with actual security needs. The Kennedy administration's military buildup revealed how political incentives drove spending beyond strategic requirements. Because Kennedy campaigned in 1960 on the missile gap, claimed that Eisenhower had allowed the Soviets to gain strategic advantage, that America was vulnerable to Soviet nuclear attack, and this was false. Intelligence showed America had overwhelming nuclear superiority, but the missile gap was politically useful, allowed Kennedy to attack Republicans as weak on defense. And defense contractors and Air Force supported the claims because they wanted more spending. And after taking office, Kennedy learned the missile gap didn't exist, but expanded weapons programs anyway. Couldn't admit he'd been wrong. Couldn't reduce spending after campaigning on strength. And this established pattern where threat inflation drove spending, where politicians competed to appear strong by supporting military budgets, where contractors and services lobbied for programs regardless of need. And the spending increased not because threats increased, but because political and institutional incentives all pointed toward expansion. And McNamara at Defense tried to impose rational planning, tried to evaluate programs based on cost-benefit analysis and strategic necessity, but faced resistance from military services that wanted their preferred weapons regardless of analysis, from contractors that wanted profitable programs regardless of effectiveness, and from Congress that wanted spending in their districts regardless of strategy. And this conflict between rational planning and institutional interests would repeat for decades, with institutional interests almost always winning. Because rational analysis might show that certain weapons were unnecessary or that certain bases should close, but contractors employed workers who voted, military services had congressional allies, and politicians needed campaign contributions, so programs continued regardless of strategic merit. And efficiency and effectiveness became secondary to political and institutional imperatives. The Vietnam War demonstrated how the military-industrial complex produced not just waste but catastrophe, because the war was driven partly by ideological commitment to containing communism, partly by credibility concerns about American power, but also by institutional interests that benefited from prolonged conflict. Defense contractors made billions selling helicopters and bombs and defoliants. The Air Force got to demonstrate its bombing theories. The Army grew in size and budget, and the whole apparatus of permanent war mobilization found purpose and justification. And this created perverse incentives. The war's continuation served institutional interests even as it clearly wasn't serving national interests, wasn't achieving objectives, was killing tens of thousands of Americans and millions of Vietnamese, was dividing American society, and was demonstrating the limits of military power against guerrilla warfare and nationalist movements. But the institutional momentum was enormous. Generals kept requesting more troops. Contractors kept producing more weapons. Politicians kept approving more spending, because admitting failure meant threatening the budgets and careers and profits that depended on continuation. And the war continued years beyond any reasonable hope of success, continued through 2 administrations, continued despite massive public opposition, because the interests that benefited from continuation were concentrated and politically powerful while the interests harmed were diffuse and politically weak. And this was the military-industrial complex at work, producing policy that served itself rather than the nation. And when the war finally ended in defeat and humiliation, the system faced no accountability. Defense budgets dropped briefly but recovered quickly. The contractors remained profitable. The generals retired to consulting positions, and the institutional structures remained intact, ready to produce the next disaster. The Reagan buildup in the 1980s showed the system operating at peak effectiveness, because Reagan campaigned on restoring American strength after the alleged weakness of the Carter years, promised massive defense increases, and delivered. Defense spending nearly doubled in real terms. New weapons programs proliferated. Star Wars missile defense promised technological solutions to nuclear threat. And defense contractors had the most profitable years in their history, but much of this spending was unnecessary. The Soviet economy was collapsing. Soviet military was increasingly obsolete. The threat was declining, not increasing. But this didn't matter because the institutional interests all aligned for expansion. Defense contractors lobbied for programs and contributed to campaigns. Military services wanted new weapons and larger forces. Conservative politicians wanted to appear strong. And constituencies in defense-dependent regions wanted jobs and spending. So the buildup happened, regardless of strategic necessity, and much of the spending was wasted. Weapons that didn't work, programs that ran years behind schedule and billions over budget, readiness problems because money went to new procurement rather than maintenance and training. But the waste didn't matter politically because it was distributed across the country. Every state had defense contractors. Every congressional district had subcontractors or bases. So every member of Congress had incentive to support defense spending and few had incentive to question it. And this geographic distribution was intentional. Contractors deliberately spread production across multiple states to build political support. And this made cutting defense spending almost impossible because it meant cutting jobs in your own district. And the few politicians who tried to reduce spending or cancel wasteful programs faced attack ads funded by defense contractors, faced primary challenges from opponents who promised to protect defense jobs, and usually either lost or backed down. So the system became politically invulnerable, could survive waste and scandal and even the end of the Cold War, because it had embedded itself into American political economy so deeply that cutting it would require political suicide. The end of the Cold War should have been the peace dividend, the moment when the justification for massive permanent military spending disappeared and America could return to normal peacetime defense posture. And initially this seemed to happen. Defense budgets declined in the 1990s, force structure shrank, some bases closed, and there was talk of using the savings for domestic investment, for infrastructure and education and healthcare, but the decline was modest and temporary. Defense spending dropped from about 6% of GDP to about 3%, still far above historical peacetime levels, and then started increasing again even before September 11th, and the military-industrial complex adapted to the new environment, developed new justifications for continued spending. The Powell Doctrine required overwhelming force for any intervention. Requiring large, expensive military, humanitarian intervention became new mission requiring special capabilities. Terrorism became new threat requiring intelligence and special operations and global reach. Rogue states with WMD became justification for missile defense and power projection, and defense contractors adapted their products, shifted from countering Soviet tanks to precision weapons and stealth aircraft and network-centric warfare, and the institutional interests that had developed during Cold War remained intact. The contractors still needed profits. The military services still wanted new weapons. The bases and facilities still employed millions. The congressional districts still depended on defense spending. So the lobbying and political pressure continued, and politicians still needed campaign contributions and still wanted to appear strong on defense. So the spending continued, and the peace dividend was mostly squandered. Some savings were redirected, but much of the infrastructure and spending persisted, waiting for new threats to justify expansion. And those threats emerged on September 11th, and the system ramped up to unprecedented levels. The War on Terror was the military-industrial complex's perfect war because it was open-ended. Terrorism is tactic, not enemy. So the war could never be won. It was global, could justify operations anywhere. It was vaguely defined. Almost any military action could be justified as counterterrorism, and it had bipartisan support. Opposing it meant risking accusations of weakness. And this created permission for unlimited spending. Defense budgets doubled. New technologies and weapons systems proliferated. Private military contractors became massive industry, and the spending continued regardless of results. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were clearly failing, weren't achieving objectives, were creating more terrorists than they killed, but the spending increased anyway, because failure created justification for more spending. We're losing, so we need more resources. And success would have created justification for continued spending. We're winning, so we need to maintain our capabilities. So the system was unfalsifiable. Any outcome justified continued spending, and the contractors made fortunes, not just traditional defense companies, but new players, private security companies like Blackwater, IT contractors, construction companies, logistics providers, and this created whole new lobbying constituencies, and the revolving door accelerated. Generals retired to defense company boards, CIA directors became consultants, Pentagon officials became lobbyists, and this created networks where the same people moved between government and industry, making decisions while in government that benefited companies they would later join. And this wasn't necessarily corrupt in legal sense, but it aligned interests perfectly. And it meant that the people making policy decisions about war and military spending had personal financial interests in continued conflict and expansion. And this corruption of decision-making was perhaps the most damaging aspect of the system, because it meant wars were fought and continued partly because they were profitable. Interventions happened partly because they justified budgets, and threat inflation became standard practice because it justified spending, and rational strategic assessment became impossible because the people doing the assessment had interests in reaching particular conclusions. The F-35 fighter program exemplifies how the system produces waste while becoming politically invulnerable, because the F-35 was meant to be an affordable multi-role fighter that could replace multiple existing aircraft, promised to save money through commonality and mass production, but became the most expensive weapons program in history. Total cost over the aircraft's lifetime exceeding $1.7 trillion, more than entire GDP of most countries, and the program has been plagued by problems. Technical failures, cost overruns, schedule delays, performance shortfalls. The aircraft still can't do everything it was supposed to do. Costs far more per flight hour than the planes it's replacing, and has suffered from concurrency where production started before testing finished, meaning aircraft had to be retrofitted repeatedly. But the program is politically invulnerable, can't be canceled despite the problems, because Lockheed Martin deliberately spread production across 45 states, ensured that subcontractors and jobs existed in almost every congressional district. So canceling the program means killing jobs in your district, facing angry constituents and campaign attack ads. And the foreign sales create international pressure, allied countries that bought the F-35 lobbying for continuation, and the sunk cost fallacy operates. We've already spent hundreds of billions, so we can't stop now. And the military services need to justify the program because they've built their force planning around it. So despite being perhaps the clearest example of military-industrial complex dysfunction, the F-35 will continue for decades, absorbing resources that could go to more effective capabilities or to non-military priorities, but serving its real purpose perfectly, enriching contractors, providing jobs in politically important districts, and justifying continued defense spending. And this pattern repeats across weapons programs. The literal combat ship that doesn't work in literal combat, the Gerald Ford carrier that costs $13 billion and has elevator problems, the Army's future combat systems that spent $18 billion before cancellation, each program justified by inflated threats and optimistic promises, each running over budget and behind schedule, each politically protected by distributed production and lobbying, and each persisting long after rational analysis would recommend cancellation. The think tank and advocacy ecosystem extends the military-industrial complex beyond contractors and Pentagon, because defense companies fund think tanks that produce research justifying higher spending, fund advocacy groups that lobby Congress and shape public opinion, fund university programs that train the next generation of defense intellectuals. And this creates intellectual infrastructure supporting permanent military expansion. The think tanks produce reports showing growing threats and capability gaps, recommend new weapons and larger forces, and their scholars testify to Congress and appear on media and advise presidential campaigns, lending academic credibility to industry-serving positions. And this isn't necessarily conscious corruption. Many scholars genuinely believe their recommendations, but the funding shapes research agendas, determines what questions get asked, influences what conclusions seem reasonable, and scholars know that recommendations for lower spending or less intervention won't get them invited back, won't get renewed funding, won't advance their careers. So the incentives push toward hawkishness, toward finding threats and recommending military solutions. And this intellectual ecosystem creates the ideas and threat assessments that justify spending, provides the policy rationale that contractors need, and it's difficult to counter because it appears independent and objective. These are scholars at prestigious institutions, not company lobbyists. But the funding sources create systematic bias, and genuine critics face difficulty finding platforms and funding. So the debate becomes one-sided, skewed toward expansion and intervention, and this shapes elite opinion, shapes what presidents hear from advisors, shapes what media reports as expert consensus, and creates the intellectual permission structure for continued military spending and intervention. The jobs argument is the political trump card that makes the military-industrial complex nearly immune to budget cuts, because defense spending employs millions of people directly and millions more indirectly. And these are often good jobs, skilled manufacturing and engineering, in regions that might not have many alternatives, and this creates constituencies that will fight desperately to preserve defense spending. Workers who need the jobs, communities that depend on the economic activity, unions that represent defense workers, local businesses that serve defense facilities, and politicians who represent these constituencies. And the argument is simple and powerful. Cutting defense spending means killing jobs, means hurting working families, means devastating communities. And this argument trumps analysis of strategic necessity or program effectiveness. Because politicians care about their constituents' jobs more than abstract strategic assessments, and the defense industry deliberately uses this, threatens layoffs when programs face cuts, produces studies showing economic impact, mobilizes workers to lobby their representatives. And this almost always works, because no politician wants to be responsible for job losses in their district. And the jobs argument also appears progressive, defending working-class employment against cuts, makes opposition to military spending seem elitist and callous, and this makes it difficult to build coalitions for reducing defense budgets, because labor unions often support defense spending, because progressive politicians from defense-dependent districts support their constituents' jobs, and this fractures potential opposition. But the jobs argument is largely false, because military spending creates fewer jobs per dollar than almost any alternative use of public money. Building weapons is capital-intensive, benefits corporations and highly skilled workers, but doesn't employ many people relative to cost, whereas infrastructure spending or education or healthcare would create more jobs per dollar and would create jobs in all congressional districts, not just those with defense plants. But this economic reality doesn't matter politically, because existing defense jobs are visible and concentrated while alternative jobs are hypothetical and diffuse. So the political power favors continuation. And this jobs-based political protection makes the military-industrial complex almost impossible to shrink. Because shrinking it means concentrated visible job losses, while benefits are abstract and diffuse. The profit motive fundamentally corrupts defense policy because it creates a situation where some of the most powerful corporations in America profit from war and preparation for war, and this creates obvious incentive to promote policies that lead to conflict, to inflate threats, to oppose diplomatic solutions, to recommend military intervention. And while this doesn't mean defense contractors directly cause wars, the influence is subtler and more systematic. They fund think tanks that recommend hawkish policies. They employ lobbyists who push for higher spending. They contribute to political campaigns of pro-military politicians. They hire retired generals who advocate for programs while appearing on media as independent experts. They create revolving door relationships with Pentagon officials who will later join their boards. And this creates an ecosystem where the people making decisions about war and peace have financial incentives favoring war and military spending. And this is corruption in systemic sense, even if no laws are broken, because it distorts decision-making away from national interest toward corporate profit. And it's nearly impossible to combat because it's legal. Campaign contributions are legal. Lobbying is legal. Hiring retired officials is legal. Funding think tanks is legal. But the cumulative effect is that policy gets made to serve contractor profits rather than security needs. And this is visible in the constant threat inflation, the exaggeration of Chinese and Russian capabilities, the portrayal of Iran and North Korea as existential threats, the warnings about capability gaps and windows of vulnerability, all of which serve to justify higher spending. And it's visible in the resistance to diplomatic solutions. Defense contractors don't profit from diplomacy, profit from tension and conflict and arms races. So the incentive is to oppose negotiations, to dismiss diplomatic progress, to emphasize worst-case scenarios that require military responses. And this systematic bias toward militarism, embedded in the profit motive of major corporations with enormous political influence, this undermines democracy, undermines rational policymaking, and makes peaceful foreign policy extremely difficult to pursue. The budget process is rigged to favor defense spending through multiple mechanisms that make cuts nearly impossible, because defense spending is mostly discretionary, but is treated as untouchable. Social Security and Medicare face constant pressure to cut despite being popular programs that people rely on. But defense spending rarely faces serious scrutiny, is proposed by Pentagon, supported by contractors and military services, defended by congressional armed services committees whose members are often from defense-dependent districts and receive heavy defense industry contributions, and the budget committees largely defer to armed services committees on defense spending, and this creates one-way ratchet. Spending increases are easy to pass. Any new threat or program gets supported, but cuts are extremely difficult, are portrayed as weakening America, as killing jobs, as benefiting adversaries. And the few politicians who advocate cuts are marginalized, are painted as naive or unpatriotic, face well-funded challengers in next election, and usually either lose or back down. And the budget process also enables waste through emergency supplemental appropriations, where war spending happens outside normal budget process, doesn't count against deficit targets, faces less scrutiny, and this was how Iraq and Afghanistan wars were funded for years. Hundreds of billions in supplemental appropriations that bypassed normal budget discipline, and the process enables programs to be locked in. Once program reaches production phase, it becomes almost impossible to cancel, because cancellation costs are concentrated while continuation costs are diffuse. And contractors game this by lowballing initial cost estimates to get programs approved. Then costs escalate, but program continues because sunk costs, and this pattern repeats constantly. And oversight is weak because inspectors general and GAO can identify waste, but can't force changes. Congress can hold hearings, but members who receive defense industry contributions rarely push hard. And media coverage is limited because defense issues are complex and seem technical and boring compared to other political conflicts. So the waste and dysfunction continue largely hidden from public awareness. The regional economic dependency creates political economy where whole regions rely on military spending and therefore become constituencies for permanent war preparation. Because Cold War spending was deliberately spread across the country but concentrated in certain regions: Southern California's aerospace industry, New England's submarine construction, Texas's military bases, Virginia's Pentagon and contractors, and these regions developed economies dependent on defense spending. Their prosperity tied to military budgets, their workers employed in defense industries, their research universities funded by defense grants, their political power devoted to preserving and expanding military spending. And this creates bipartisan support. Liberal politicians from these regions support defense spending despite dovish positions on other issues, because their constituents need the jobs. And conservative politicians have easy time defending spending because their ideology supports strong military anyway. And this regional dependency means that any attempt to reduce military spending faces opposition from both parties, faces economic arguments about devastation to defense-dependent regions, and faces political reality that politicians from these regions will never support cuts that hurt their constituents. And this dependency is self-reinforcing, because defense spending concentrates more in regions that already depend on it, through base realignment processes and contractor location decisions. And this creates political geography that favors military spending. And it's difficult to reverse, because alternative economic development takes time and investment and faces uncertainty, whereas defense spending is reliable and large-scale and continues regardless of economic conditions. So regions rationally stay dependent on defense even when dependency is ultimately harmful, and this creates permanent political coalition for military spending that transcends ideology and party, making significant reductions nearly impossible through normal democratic processes. The secrecy and classification system enables waste and abuse by hiding information from public and Congress. Because much defense spending is classified, weapons programs and capabilities are secret for legitimate security reasons, but also to prevent scrutiny, and contractors and Pentagon use classification to hide problems. cost overruns and performance failures and testing problems are often classified, preventing press from reporting and public from knowing how their money is being wasted. And Congress faces difficulty exercising oversight when information is classified. Members without security clearances can't review classified programs. Members with clearances can't publicly discuss what they learn, and this enables enormous waste in black budget programs that are completely secret, whose budgets aren't published, whose purposes aren't explained, and these programs face minimal oversight, are ripe for abuse, and total perhaps $50 billion annually. Nobody really knows. Because it's secret, and the classification system is wildly overused, millions of documents classified annually, much of it to hide embarrassment or incompetence rather than protect genuine secrets. And this systematic secrecy undermines democratic accountability, prevents citizens from making informed judgments about defense policy, prevents press from investigating waste and fraud, and enables the military-industrial complex to operate largely in darkness, where decisions are made and money is spent without public awareness or consent. And this is antithetical to democracy, which requires informed public and transparent government. But the classification system makes defense policy perhaps the least transparent area of government, and attempts to reform classification face resistance from agencies that benefit from secrecy, from contractors that hide behind classification, and from politicians who use classification to avoid difficult questions. The alternatives to the current system exist, but face overwhelming political obstacles. Because economic conversion, the idea of transitioning defense workers and facilities to civilian production, has been studied extensively. We know it's feasible. We know it could create more jobs and produce more useful products than current defense spending. But it requires planning and investment and political will, requires retraining workers, requires finding new products for facilities to build, requires government support during transition. And this faces opposition from defense contractors who profit from current system, from workers who fear uncertainty of transition, from politicians who don't want disruption in their districts, and from ideological conservatives who view defense spending as legitimate government function while skeptical of industrial policy for civilian purposes. So conversion doesn't happen, and defense budget cuts without conversion face harsh resistance because they mean job losses without alternatives. So the system perpetuates, and global arms control and diplomatic engagement, reducing threats through negotiation rather than military buildup. This would enable lower defense spending, but faces opposition from military-industrial complex, from contractors and think tanks and politicians who profit from threat inflation, and from ideological hawks who view military strength as ultimate security. So serious arms control rarely happens, and defense budget transparency, simply making spending and programs less secret so public and press can scrutinize. This would help, but faces resistance from Pentagon and contractors who benefit from secrecy, and campaign finance reform, reducing defense industry's ability to buy political influence through contributions. This would help enormously, but faces constitutional questions and political opposition from beneficiaries. So the pathologies continue, and breaking the system would require tackling all these obstacles simultaneously, would require massive political movement. But no such movement exists. Defense issues aren't salient enough to mobilize voters. Benefits are too diffuse while costs are concentrated. And the system has become so deeply embedded in American political economy that changing it seems almost impossible. The consequences are measured in trillions of dollars wasted, in wars fought for institutional interests rather than national security, in diplomatic opportunities rejected because they threaten defense budgets, in regional economies distorted toward military production, in scientific research directed toward weapons instead of civilian benefits, in democratic processes corrupted by defense industry money, and in American foreign policy permanently biased toward military solutions. And the opportunity costs are staggering. The trillions spent on military could have rebuilt American infrastructure, could have provided universal health care, could have funded energy transition, could have eliminated poverty, could have supported scientific research with greater social benefit than weapons development, but instead flowed to contractors and weapons programs and overseas interventions that made Americans less safe rather than more safe. And the military-industrial complex doesn't defend America so much as it defends itself. perpetuates its own existence, grows its own budgets, expands its own influence, regardless of external threats or strategic requirements. It's a machine that feeds itself, that creates justifications for its continuation, that corrupts the political processes that should control it, and that has become effectively autonomous, operating according to its own logic of institutional preservation and profit maximization rather than democratic oversight or strategic necessity, proving Eisenhower's warning was prophetic that the military-industrial complex would become the gravest threat to American democracy, not because of conspiracy or evil intent, but because of aligned interests and institutional incentives and political power, creating a system that serves itself at expense of national interest, that perpetuates permanent war preparation and frequent actual wars, that wastes enormous resources while claiming to provide security, and that has become so politically entrenched that reform seems nearly impossible without crisis or catastrophe, making the military-industrial complex the clearest example of how concentrated interests capture democratic government, how institutional incentives override public interest, and how systems designed for one purpose evolve to serve themselves regardless of consequences. The perfect machine for converting public resources into private profit while wrapping itself in patriotism and security. Essentially untouchable through normal politics, requiring extraordinary intervention to reform or constrain, and until that happens, continuing to shape American policy toward permanent military mobilization, frequent intervention, and enormous spending that serves contractors and careers and constituencies, but that undermines genuine security, squanders resources, and corrupts democracy.